Here. Great. All right. That'll work. Yeah, that's great. I'm going to apologize in advance if I start coughing. I'm dealing right now with what my doctor calls a post-inflammatory bronchospasm, which means I'm coughing, but I'm not contagious. Hi, my name is Jay Bushman. I am a writer-producer of, call it interactive, cross-platform, insert one of a million buzzwords, storytelling. So I'm coming to you from inside a bubble that we call the future of storytelling. Now, you all know the drill, right? There's some new technology or platform or format, and everyone asks, how do we use this for storytelling? There's a hype cycle, there's a backlash against the hype cycle, then something new comes along, and the whole thing starts all over again. So now an important caveat. This is Los Angeles, so I'm speaking from the perspective of entertainment, or more importantly, the entertainment industry. Now that comes with a whole host of assumptions, constraints, and built-in biases, but we do not have time to uncover all of those right now. So I've spent the last 10 years working in a weird area that sometimes goes by the name Transmedia Storytelling. Oh, sorry, I'm advancing the wrong one. Okay. Thank you. Now, nobody likes this word. And the people who work in this field, we kind of have a joke, and it goes, you put two transmedia creators in a room together, and pretty soon you'll have three definitions of transmedia. And this is kind of a stock talk I usually give, but I'm not giving that one to you guys today. The short version of what transmedia is telling stories over multiple platforms. But what that looks like in reality changes greatly depending on your definition of stories or platforms or telling or multiple or over. As an example, this is a project I worked on a few years ago called the Lizzie Bennet Diaries. Imagine if instead of elections, Russian intelligence was more concerned with Jane Austen. So this was a constructed reality we embedded over multiple channels, YouTube and multiple social media platforms that told the story of Pride and Prejudice continuously in real time over the span of an entire year. Here are a bunch of other transmedia projects I've worked on over the years. Some were successful, a lot more were not. And there are a million reasons why an interactive project can fail. But I've become really fascinated by watching new forms of storytelling and trying to locate the exact instant where they fall apart. And where we think the audience wants one thing, and they might, up until the moment that they don't. I call this instant the Ovaltine Moment. Now, how many of you remember the 1983 movie A Christmas Story? Okay, we got a few people. For those of you who have not seen it, A Christmas Story follows beleaguered 9-year-old Ralphie through a series of comic vignettes in his small Indiana town in the 1930s. Now, one story focuses on Ralphie's favorite radio serial, Little Orphan Annie, sponsored by the very popular powdered chocolatey malt beverage Ovaltine. When Ralphie learns that Annie is going to broadcast secret messages that can only be deciphered by members of her secret society, he eagerly sends away for a membership and gets an official decoder ring. And then the day arrives when the secret message is broadcast, and he's breathless with excitement. But when he decodes it, it says, "Be sure to drink your Ovaltine." So an Ovaltine moment is when the bubble bursts. When the excitement of discovery and anticipation slides into disappointment and just, and when those awful 5 words pop into your head. Now, that's not to say that viral marketing is the only kind of Ovaltine moment, but it's one of the clearest to understand. But an Ovaltine moment happens anytime an audience feels the novelty of the innovation wear off and they're feeling left to feel hollow. And that cool new tool, platform, format, or future of storytelling method is revealed to be as gimmicky and forgettable as something like, say, smell-o-vision. Now, I first became sensitive to this phenomenon when it happened to me. And to discuss that, we're going to have to talk about alternate reality games. How many of y'all are familiar with ARGs? Okay, a few. For those who aren't, so ARGs are, wait, hang on a second. There we go. ARGs use a wide variety of different online and real-world media, mixing puzzles and stories to create a real-time narrative experience. They play with the boundaries between fiction and reality. They are often promotional or marketing tie-ins for very expensive movies and TV shows and video games. I got into them as a player during what is now considered the first one for the Steven Spielberg movie AI. That's also sometimes called The Beast. And as a player of that, that was the thing that yanked me off of the path of a more kind of normal career as a writer. There have been several other big ones. Why So Serious for The Dark Knight, Year Zero are a couple of examples. There have also been smaller, more independent ones like Perplex City and the Jejune Institute. Here are a few ARGs that I had a chance to write, which was a ton of fun. And ARGs are amazing because they can fire the imagination and they can create these close-knit temporary communities. The challenge is it's very hard to make them sustainable. As a game goes on, everything escalates. Puzzle solving becomes a race. Story beats are digested at lightning speed. The pace becomes frenetic. It's very hard to keep up. And if you miss something, it's really easy to get left behind. And even worse, if you happen to miss the run of an ARG, there's literally no way for you to go back and re-experience it. If you miss it, you miss it. Playing an ARG is a ton of work. So I can tell you the exact moment I tasted the Ovaltine with ARGs. It was 10 years ago. And I was at SeaTac Airport, and I walked past a bus shelter that had the following poster. Now, this is a fairly standard ARG rabbit hole, a call to action to go to this website and enter into this story's reality. And I saw this, and my immediate reaction was, no, I am not going to stop the International. And this really surprised me because I was an ARG evangelist. People got sick of me talking to them about ARGs, and then suddenly I had this instinctive, recoil. So I reflected on where that came from. And what I saw was I instinctively knew that it was just too much work and that the payoff for playing this would not be worth the effort I put into it. So I tried to hold on to this feeling when I was making my own projects and always look to see when an audience had a similar moment. So a few years later, I got to work at a company called Fourth Wall Studios, which was built specifically to try and solve the problems of ARGs. And to do that, we built this platform called Rides. So what Rides was it was basically a giant synchronization engine that synced web media with emails, phone calls, and text messages. So you'd be watching a show, and you'd get an email from something inside the world of the story, or you'd get a text message from one of the characters. The killer feature of Rides were the phone calls. You'd be watching a video, a character on screen would have their phone ring, your phone would ring. The character would start having a conversation with someone, and the person they were talking to on the other side of their phone, you heard what they were saying on your phone. And the conversation would go back and forth between the screen and your phone, and it would stay in perfect sync. Now, the first time you see this, I can see people in the audience going oh my God, yeah, that's really cool. The first time you see this, it is the coolest thing you've ever seen. The fourth time it happens, you're oh my God, shut up, I'm trying to watch this video. So what we discovered was once the novelty wore off, we were actually fighting against what the audience was really after. So why do these Ovaltine moments happen? What I think is happening is that audiences are drawn in by the lure of novelty, that it excites something in their lizard brain they've never seen before, but that wears off really quickly. And when it does, they revert to their core desires: engaging story, emotional connection, and meaningful experience, all the things that our novelty is getting in the way of. But we who do this work are so focused on this novelty, we define our work and ourselves by the tools we're trying to develop. We use the novelty as our sales pitch. When we fall in love with our tools, we can blind ourselves to what our audiences really want, and then that's when we open ourselves up to Ovaltine moments. Some of these can be very hard to spot when you're in the middle of it. Other times, it's a little easier. This was announced this week. And something like this is born out of the mindset of, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? Well, maybe, but you're essentially telling your audience that for half of the hours of the day, they're not allowed to watch your show. Makes for a great headline, though. Now, there's one show this year that has sparked more Ovaltine conversations for me than anything else. How many of you saw Bandersnatch, right? Okay. A fair amount, all right. My feelings about Bandersnatch are very complex, but again, that's another talk that we don't have time to get into all of that. But once Bandersnatch came out, I found myself having the same conversation over and over and over again. And they all went the same way through these three rounds. The first round was, you saw Bandersnatch, did you like it? Oh yeah, it was really cool, that part where you told him what Netflix was, that was neat. And then it turned into a Kung Fu movie, that was cool. But to be honest, this part is just kind of like throwing back and forth plot points and even recapitulating stuff that Netflix put in the marketing campaign. The second part of this, the second round of this conversation is, did you do all the various branches? And this leads inevitably to a moment of, yeah, some of these choices didn't really mean anything. And you can start to see the excitement wane. You can start to see them taste the Ovaltine. Then the third round, would you watch another one of these? And most of the time I have this conversation, the answer is a non-committal maybe, or probably not, or it was a lot of work, it didn't really add much to the story. Now, I have watched over and over and over again as this conversation leads people to their own Ovaltine moments. It'll be interesting to see if Netflix is doing more of these, and it'll be interesting to see if they can break through that to some kind of sustainability, or if it will just become the latest iteration of the once every decade attempt to make interactive TV a thing. But at some point, there's a choice to be made. Are we in the future of storytelling business, which means we never stick with one format until its maturity, and we keep pushing forward? Or do we step off the merry-go-round and figure out how to make something not the future of storytelling, but the right now of storytelling, and to bring some of these ideas back towards the mainstream? Because when you're always chasing the new, it's easy to look at the wider audience as old or backwards or too out of touch to make sense of the new way or whatever that is. Or at least I will confess that I thought that way for a really long time, and I'm trying to get better about that. But I've had to learn that if novelty doesn't give way to some kind of sustained audience acceptance, then all you have left is Ovaltine. And I've had to drink a lot of Ovaltine over the years. But now I welcome it. I go hunting for Ovaltine moments because they teach me when my assumptions are bad. And they make me reconsider basic premises, and they force me to keep redesigning my stories and my narrative experiences. So I make sure I'm doing everything I can to avoid putting the needs of the tech, the needs of the platform, before the needs of the people and the audience that I want to watch it. And these Ovaltine moments are useful no matter which media format or story framework I find myself working in. So I guess at the end of the day, I do agree with Little Orphan Annie. Be sure to drink your Ovaltine. Thanks a lot.
If there are any questions, we'll take, I guess, 15 minutes of questions for the last 3 lightning talks. Thanks.
This question is for Jay. I was curious, that Ovaltine moment is such a great way to describe it.
Thank you.
If video games aren't perceived as Ovaltine, what do you think is preventing the wider general audience acceptance of video games as interactive media rather than trying to bridge the gap?
I actually think video games are a really good example of something that has been accepted, at least. It's hard to, but it's also hard to, I think, describe video games as a monolithic thing, right? Because you have all kinds of different types of video games. I was at a conference last year and I saw someone deliver a paper that described a dynamic in video games that I had seen for a while, but I hadn't really been able to put my finger on it. And so I would recommend to everyone check out the person who wrote it. Her name is Hannah Wood. And the paper is called, it's like it uses terms from Russian formalism called dynamic suzhets. But the paper talks about how the assumption of game players are agency, control, and those dynamics get in the way of certain kinds of storytelling. And when you reach a, and I'm badly summarizing Hannah's point, but what she's trying to get at, I think, is there comes a moment where game players are asked to give up control in a story game that they don't want to give up control, where they don't want to give up control, and that turns them, that makes them angry. And so there's an entitlement question, and a phrase that she used was games as entitlement engines, and how stories work. A lot of types, I'm trying not to make blanket statements, but a lot of kinds of stories do not work better when you give audience agency. For a long time, I was pretty hardline in saying interactive narrative, at least in a visual sense, cannot work. Like, there is no way to make that work. It always leads to, as one of my old bosses at Fourth Wall would say, go to your bookshelf at home, look at all the books you own, how many of them are choose your own adventures? Unless you're a serious outlier, the answer is 0. I did have an experience a few years ago that changed my mind, and that was the video game Life is Strange. So now I'm sort of trying to locate exactly how to identify what in that makes that work in ways that other kinds don't.
Hey, it's a question for Jay. I was wondering if you think that you can recover from an Ovaltine moment, because I feel like personally,
yeah,
if I get disappointed in a show, I'm seconds away from telling everyone it sucks. You know,
yeah,
I'm ready to cast myself off from the whole fandom. So
it's possible. There are different. I think it's different depending on whether you look at it at the individual, and if you lose an audience member, you lose them, or if you look at them on a mass level. I mentioned that my feelings about Bandersnatch are complex. I don't think it works very well as an individual example of the format, but they have enough money and enough commitment and a large enough PR engine that they can keep banging on this, and if they find a way to make the experience itself work, they can recover from some of this stuff. And to me, that's actually the most exciting thing about it, is that they have, money gives you lots of chances to make mistakes, and they have a lot of money. So, yeah.
So what about within the context of a single movie, for example? Is there a way, when you're looking at people that get disappointed with how the plot's going,
yeah,
does anybody come back after a bad moment, or does it color their experience for the rest of the film?
I think for most people, it probably will color their experience, but there are always people, I mean, I've certainly had experiences where I watched something in whatever format and was like, that's dumb, I don't like this, and then, thought about it and thought about it and thought about it and realized that I felt differently. So that's always possible. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure.
My question's for Davion. I'm wondering, with your project to create this method of rapidly producing and iterating on digital models, how that would relate to previous precedents in architecture of physical study models, which would also be intended for fast iteration speeds, such as OMA's use of blue foam to make models. So is this a digital study model?
So I think OMA's use of blue foam kind of sits within the realm of abstraction, right? It's supposed to be this kind of thing where almost every quality is kind of cleaned from the material that you use. I think what I'm trying to do is kind of reintroduce qualities on such like a large scale that it becomes almost impossible to actually fall back onto the abstraction mode of making, right? And I think, so maybe it's kind of related, but I think there is something contemporary in good and in a bad way with this. And I think what is kind of this project actually about is this embrace of that, and like almost like a leap of faith, you know, like jumping and let's see what happens with it before we can just go back to the kind of moralistic idea of like maybe we should not do that. Maybe we should just produce architecture as we think architecture looks like, you know, because architecture has this kind of obligation to perpetuate reality in some ways. It's supposed to be static. It's supposed to be, you know. So it's a thought experiment, like meant to kind of open some areas of creativity, I guess. But maybe that's a big word. I don't know. Thank you. Yeah.
Hey, also a question for Damien. I was wondering if any of your talk or your concepts were influenced by like Stephen Wolfram and like the Wolfram Foundation. Like he often talks about the end of models, and like he's all about like computing to, you know, using our new computing power to create like a new type of math versus like
Sure.
what kind of you're doing.
This is one of those things where, so I know the precedent. The problem with that precedent is that it kind of sits firmly within this idea of mathematical complexity, like producing forms that look mathematically complex and then kind of inventing a story that we are supposed to kind of, you know, put onto these forms while they're operating on their own in some ways. So in this project, at least there is an approach that I start from the other side of the equation, right? I start from aesthetics.
Okay.
Because I think that's a discussion worth having. Like, what is actually, you know, what is when we do away with authenticity of like software making something, what is at stake, right? What is it that we like in some ways? Because some people might like the Wolfram kind of, you know, like cellular automata, right? Which produces this kind of super complex space that. But still, it's going to be an affinity problem at some point. Even once you describe it mathematically, it's going to be something there which draws you into it, or you kind of say no, I don't care about it. I'm interested in this attention idea, you know. So it's similar to that, but it's kind of the opposite way, maybe.
Totally. Yeah. Thanks.
I've got another for Damien here. I read, and you can test this maybe, but I read this project is kind of a provocation, right? An alternate vision in some sense. Do you think that there's a space for not a provocation but counter-hegemonic sort of software?
I know this is something I was thinking about a lot. You know, honestly, I came to this conclusion that the best we can do is put it forward as a proposition, because it's kind of embedded. The hegemony is embedded in the mathematics in some ways, because it's really hard to disentangle those things, right? Because this idea of space comes from this historically grounded kind of, you know, production of space, which is tied to this notion of like, you know, I mean, I don't like kind of collapsing this complex thing to one soundbite, but it really comes to this idea of like male white observer sitting outside of the world, you know, having this God mode access to the design space, and then like all the photos of the architects you see from the 20s are like the hand of God, you know, making like forms in space and so forth. I mean, it's really, I don't know how to disestablish that, because at some level you have to describe what you're making mathematically, right? I mean, so.
I have a question for Jay. I was just wondering if you could comment on how the alternate reality games, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Alternate reality games relate to some of the new things that are coming out, like Meow Wolf and Sleep No More, this sort of like experimental theater / experience economy thing.
Yeah, it's definitely a direct outgrowth, and Sleep No More was a really kind of galvanizing moment for me when I saw it, because I started in the theater and I went from theater to film to digital to interactive to transmedia, and I had always thought that that was kind of a straight line. And then about 6 or 7 years ago, I saw Sleep No More, and it was like, oh, this isn't a line, this is a circle. And all of the stuff that I've been built, like all the stuff that I thought I left behind is actually germane to this world. And right now, a lot of the energy is in the interactive, or the immersive theater space. And there's a wonderful community, if people aren't aware of it, called No Proscenium, which is sort of a clearinghouse of information about immersive theater. And they help produce a conference every year called the Immersive Design Summit, where interactive storytellers, immersive theater makers, VR and AR makers all kind of like come together, and you sort of see how these are all converging on a single point. Yeah, cool.
My question is to Jay. So as I understand, in alternate reality experiences and such, the audience has this point where they sort of have diminishing rewards with too much effort.
Yeah.
And that leads up to an Ovaltine moment when they say, no, this is too much effort, I'm
Yeah.
not going to this much. So I'm trying to contrast this to pseudo realities like climate change, anti-vaxxers, stuff like climate change deniers, anti-vaxxers, stuff like that, where I kind of see it as an audience that has been drawn too deeply into an alternate reality, where they don't have the option to say, nope, this is too much effort. They just consider it their only reality. So I guess the point I'm trying to get at is there value in learning or researching how to introduce an Ovaltine moment to sort of pop that bubble? What are your thoughts on that?
That's interesting. I'm not sure, because to me, Ovaltine moments are about making people feel disempowered, or that making there are moments when people feel like they're not part of a community, or that they, their contribution is not worthwhile. So I don't know how that. I don't know. That's an interesting thing. I will say that the entertainment framework is really important, and that's kind of why I mentioned that at the beginning, because the logic of an entertainment experience is very different from the logic of a real-world experience. And I'll give you an example of this. Towards the end of the AI game, there was the community of players that formed to play this game was called the Cloudmakers, named after something in the game. And a few months after the game ended, the community was still going. A few months after the game ended, 9/11 happened. And there was one person in the Cloudmaker community, kind of trolly person, who was like, we can solve 9/11. Look, we solved this game. Like, we have all this distributed investigation power. We tore through all these puzzles. We solved all these mysteries. We can do this in the real world. And the rest of us were like, are you crazy? This was a game that someone wrote, that was built for us to solve. This is a real world thing. They're not the same thing. Fortunately, there were people who picked this story up and then wrote about it as if the Cloudmakers all thought we could solve 9/11, which is something we've been having to fight back against for the past almost 20 years now. But my point though is that the logic of what people are looking for in the real world is different from the logic of a constructed entertainment experience.
Makes sense.
Sure.
Thank you.
This question is for Nolan. A lot of very effective marketing sells an idea of a future world that ultimately never materializes, and that's often the case with timeshares. And I think it's much easier to sell a future idea that can't materialize, because thinking about the future is much simpler than the present, which is always much more messy. And I wonder if you have any ideas or insight in how to effectively market presence.
I think that presence was the very beginning of that whole cost analysis, that learning to be present is a time-based medium focused on now. So, selling potential futures start now. So if you take responsibility for your time presence in your interrelations with other people, and treat them with trust and empathy and nonlinear tactical agreement and disagreement, that you can find common ground presently, and that through that common ground you'll be healing the whole currently. So future rifts you can't account for because you don't have any control over that, but you do have control over present engagements.
So like by example?
Being patient with each other, being empathetic with each other in the over the course of a conversation, and also probing, intentionally disagreeing points of view, so that you can find that you, through that process, heal, both of you.
Finding out how to successfully model presence in yourself is how you demonstrate it to others?
I think so. I think so. I think that by learning to be present within yourself, you're functioning as the model or the mold that you would like to represent to other people in that process. So by slowing down your thoughts, by using maybe less words, by being patient and listening deeply, that's the trick to being present. It's not just a thing that happens individually, it happens as a two-way street. And the whole idea of a timeshare being that we are all fractional owners of this thing, but it's our individual responsibility to be present and to be patient and to be empathetic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that by doing that, we end up building a relational whole. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you to Nolan, Jay, and Damien. We're breaking for lunch till the gaming session at 1:15. Please note that instructions for the burrito or the wraps are to unpackage the wrap. You have to pull the tab on the back of the wrap. Also, please also note that there's actually a